Hi there, everyone. My name is Asra Nomani. I'm Vice President of Strategy and Investigations at Parents Defending Education. I'm so happy to have you join us today for a really exciting conversation. We are so happy to announce to you today that we have launched a new initiative at Parents Defending Education. We have put forward a report on private schools. We're calling it Private Schools 101. And in it, we are exploring resources and issues that are emerging in private schools. The main goal of tonight is to talk to parents and make you aware of the differences between public schools and private schools, the similarities, the issues that are emerging, and what private school parents can do in standing up for the values in which they believe and the concerns that they have. You know, these are issues that affect so many people. I'll just tell a small story that I came to this country from India, and my mother in India was a child who went to a private school. The name was St. Joseph's Convent. I had to check with my mom in the hills outside of Bombay, India. And to this day, my mother in her 80s remembers her teacher. Her name was Miss Corner. And we know that there can be beautiful experiences in all schools. And my mother was able to learn critical thinking and even English to teach me then as a child. So we also know that there are challenges in all schools. And what we are going to do today is walk through the landscape of our private school industry in the United States and these various issues. So first, I would love to introduce you to our distinguished guests today. First, we have Aimee Viana, Distinguished Education Fellow at Parents Defending Education. Hello, Aimee.
Hey, Asra.
And then we have Ashley Jacobs, Executive Director of Parents Unite, an organization that has emerged to help empower parents. Hello, Ashley.
Hi, Asra.
And finally, we have Scott Johnston. He is the author of a best-selling book called Campusland, and he's the writer and founder of a blog called The Naked Dollar. So wonderful to have you here too, Scott.
Hi, Asra, and fellow thought criminals.
Very well put. You know, we're always asked to kind of explain ourselves as parents oftentimes, and I'm just so honored to be here with you all because you stand up with so much moral and intellectual courage. So thank you for joining us today. We'll first try to give our parents a lay of the land, what is happening in private school industry. And for that, Aimee, thank you for joining us. Tell us first, why do you care about this issue of private school industries? Why should parents care about private schools?
Sure. Parents should care about private schools, Ezra, because they care about their children's education. And so private schools offer parents many times things that they can't access in a public school setting, like smaller classes, higher parental involvement opportunities, more rigorous academic programs at times. There is also the added benefit of having specialized attention to students. And as you mentioned with your mom's example, more religious instruction than a public school obviously could provide. Sometimes they have fewer standardized tests or less content that's simply taught to pass a standardized test. And some families feel that those things are a better fit for their child. And those families have opportunities to enroll their children, certainly with their own funding, but some families choose to enroll their children in private schools by paying out of pocket or, as I mentioned, or using funds available from a 529 plan, for example. And financial support for private school choice to families that would not pay out of pocket, for example, may also be available through vouchers or scholarship programs, through tax credits or deductions, or through education saving accounts. And so based on data that's available from December 2021, at least one form of private school choice is offered in 32 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. And there are many different types of private schools. There's, of course, the traditional private school, not funded by the government, which gives them more freedom on curriculum and operational structure. Most of the funding comes from tuition costs. Some schools are referred to as independent schools, and these can be day schools or boarding schools. They can be co-ed or single sex. Sometimes they're religiously affiliated, and at times they're not. And they're independent, as the title references, in both their finances, of course, being funded through tuition payments and charitable contributions, but also in their philosophies. Each school is run by a unique mission and set of principles, which defines it and the way that it operates. There are language immersion schools as well. A total immersion school, for example, teaches all classes in a foreign language. A partial immersion school will teach half of the classes in English, for example, math and science, and the other half in a second language. There are Montessori schools, right? The Montessori method is described as a child-centered educational approach based on scientific observations of children from birth to adulthood. Many people are familiar with the Montessori method. And of course, there are private schools that specialize in special education with concentrations on students that may come with special needs. For example, those who may be on the autism spectrum or who have ADHD or some other type of learning challenge. And so staff in those schools can be specially trained to assist students with those developmental disorders. And there are, of course, students who may require more individualized attention than those with average needs, and those parents may feel that that's a good fit for them. We have, of course, our religious schools, as I mentioned, schools affiliated with a religious faith, but not necessarily a specific institution. And the curriculum in those schools might include education in the history and culture that is associated with that particular faith tradition. And students there would be expected to comport themselves according to the rules and expectations of that religion or faith tradition. Parochial schools are a little more specific than a religious school. A parochial school generally refers to a school that is affiliated with and receives funding from a local church. And so those are typically Roman Catholic parochial schools that are organized by a diocese, usually with the administration overseen by a bishop and an advisory board that is appointed by said bishop and his leadership. Of course, the homeschool option is not to be ignored and is being embraced by so many more families nowadays. All 50 states have established homeschool laws. And so some states place numerous requirements on homeschooling, such as assessments and attendance, while other states have minimal or no homeschooling requirements at all. And so how do parents fund private school? As I mentioned, vouchers or scholarship programs can use public funds to finance student attendance at some private schools. And those payments are made directly from the government to a parent or to an institution on behalf of a parent, and then are used to support student attendance at a private school. The majority of voucher programs have been implemented at the state level or at the local level. There are also tax credits and deductions. State tax credits and deductions support private school education, take several forms. State scholarships or ESA tax credits reduce a corporation or an individual's tax liability for donations that are made to a third-party organization that provides the scholarships, for example, vouchers or ESAs to eligible students. Individual state tax credits reduce an individual's tax liability based on educational expenses for household dependents. And individual state tax deductions provide a reduction in taxable income based on educational expenses for household dependents that is determined prior to the calculation of tax liability for that household. And of course, you have education savings accounts, which are state-funded individual accounts that are controlled by parents and are used to purchase educational services. So Asra, unlike vouchers, which are used specifically to support private school attendance, ESA funds can generally be used for a variety of educational related expenses, such as tutoring, textbooks, private school, or even online courses.
Great.
And so hopefully that gives you a little bit of the landscape and helps to set up our conversation.
Yeah, and we will absolutely. One of the great things that we're doing at Parents Defending Education is putting all these types of resources online, and we're going to have a special page for private school information, and we'll have all of this available to you all if you weren't able to take notes fast enough. But thank you so much, Amy. And what's remarkable to me is when you look at the data, it's 1 out of 10 students in the United States that goes to private schools. So somewhere in all of the dynamics that you laid out, parents are figuring out exactly, 1 out of 10 parents is 1 out of 10 children have their parents figuring out how to go to private school. So it's a very real dynamic in our society today. What do we see so much of what the public school parents do in terms of holding school officials accountable through Freedom of Information Act requests and, appealing to politicians and policymakers. What role does the government have in overseeing our private school industry in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question, Asra. So the U.S. Constitution does not directly address education. That's why the predominant role in setting education policy is played by state and local governments. And due to this, of course, they vary significantly, right, across the country. And so in 1925, actually, the Supreme Court recognized that liberty includes the right to choose private education. And confronted with an Oregon statute that mandated public school attendance, the Supreme Court ruled that that statute was unconstitutional. And so it recognized that there is that freedom to be able to choose a private education. Now, while the parameters of state regulations of private schools are shaped by our Constitution, it's important to know that on occasion, federal law does directly influence the operations of private schools. For example, federal law prohibits discrimination in the admission policies of non-sectarian schools. The relationship between state governments and private schools can be established and maintained through federal grants. And no two states regulate private schools in the same way. Rather, their respective statutes reflect the unique circumstances and concerns faced by local communities.
Okay, great. So the real challenge for a lot of parents is figuring out how to hold private schools accountable oftentimes. And so we really struggle with trying to figure out offering guidance. But one of the issues that always emerges, Amy, is the enrollment contract that parents sign or guardians sign when they enroll a child with a private school. So what is the leeway that they've got with enrollment contracts?
Sure. So what I would say is to read everything thoroughly before entering into any type of contract. Many times the contract can take the shape of, for example, a student handbook in which the parents need to sign off that they have read and agreed and acknowledged, for example, that they will follow all of the school's policies and procedures. And many times at the end of those handbooks, it says that those policies can be amended. And so it is important for parents to be fully aware of the type of school in which they are enrolling, what the mission of the school is, and just be very knowledgeable before signing on that dotted line. Yeah. Family engagement, as you know, is one of the strongest predictors of a child's school success. And it's that responsibility of the parents to hold the schools accountable. But in those documents, it will detail ways in which parents can and cannot hold those schools accountable. And so it would be essential to be just very informed before making that commitment.
Yeah, and it's been really eye-opening for me to actually read some of those enrollment contracts, and they have some clauses sometimes about parent cooperation, right? And that's the buzzword sometimes used to make sure that there isn't dissent from amongst the parents. And it is difficult, right? Because it's private industry, and then obviously that there's a protected rights that even the industry has when it has their consumers, right? That are the parents in this case. What do you recommend to parents who are thinking about moving from public school to private school?
Sure. Asra, parents know their students best. And so my recommendation is to do their homework. Parents have homework too, I always say. Yeah. And so it's important to be educated about what's going on in that private school, to read all the paperwork, to make sure that you have an opportunity to perhaps even access a sample syllabus. Many of the private schools hold open houses or shadow days where students can come in for a day or half a day just to experience what the school is like. And that may provide an opportunity for you to talk to some of the teachers and perhaps talk with the head of school or other individuals that are on the administrative team, so that they can truly get a sense as to whether or not that's the type of environment that they would like to commit to and have their child experience.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Aimee. You know, Aimee is not only a distinguished fellow with us, but she is live from Parents Defending Education. That was a mama bear calling me, I'm sure, with an emergency out there in the universe. And we always love calls from you guys. But you know, Aimee, you're not only a distinguished fellow, you have been a principal, you have worked in the U.S. Department of Education, and you're a mother. And so thank you so much for that incredible lay of the land. Really appreciate it. We're going to talk now with Ashley Jacobs. Ashley is in the trenches in the efforts to try to empower parents. She began and founded an organization called Parents Unite. So we'd love to first hear about Parents Unite. Ashley, if you could tell us and introduce us to the organization.
Thanks, Asra. We launched Parents Unite in May of 2021 because parents needed a voice. We were hearing things from parents that they were seeing. It concerned them. The Zoom school exposed a lot of what was going on behind the curtain. They also, as we just heard, have these lopsided enrollment contracts. So there's a fear to speak up. There's also curiosity around what's going on and a need to have some resources and some ways to ask questions. So our objectives really were to increase parent and trustee awareness of what we really think the big problem here is. There's been such an overfocus and a prioritization of DEI initiatives, but that's come at the expense of diversity of thought. And there's really been a very unbalanced presentation in professional development, speakers, and all of the work that's being done at schools. So we felt that if we could expose parents and NAIS to the fact that we wanted to see some balance brought back into the classroom, we could start a conversation. We wanted to connect parents and trustees to each other to learn more about what was going on. And if we couldn't get any real progress made with NAIS, we thought that we needed to find a way to start to reduce school dependence on them, on their programming and their professional development, which if you go to their website, look at all of what they've been doing for the past 10 plus years, it's incredibly unbalanced. And most people wouldn't know it because it's promoted under such lovely names like diversity and equity and inclusion, as we all know. And the average parent doesn't truly understand what that means. But I think when they saw it on Zoom this year, they were enlightened in ways they never imagined.
Yeah, and so tell parents, NAIS, how did it begin? What was its intention?
So NAIS is really, it's called the National Association for Independent Schools. And it began, 50 plus years ago as a way to really create a governing body for all of the independent schools, because independent schools are independent, right? But at some point they need ways to share information, best practices. They need some quality control. So NAIS at one point was doing all the accrediting. That's a whole nother conversation we can have, but they've since split off and are now just a membership association and have redirected the accrediting to a larger body that has 20 regional accreditors. But the gist of NAIS is really to become the thought leadership for all of the independent schools. Initially, they'd have best practices for governance, how to teach math, what to do if you're having issues finding a development officer. It's really one-stop shopping for all independent schools and all of the things that they would need to help a head of school, either build a school, grow a school, sustain a school, because they are independent. They don't rely really on government information or data. They have to do it all themselves. So I think that there was, a useful need for NAIS in the origin story, but over time it's evolved to take on more of a political agenda, as we've seen. And that's where we think the danger lies, in that it really is in some ways a monopoly, a cartel, all rolled into one. And it really doesn't do its job that I think it was initially intended.
And this isn't an awareness that you just got overnight, right? How is it that it unfolded for you even as a parent?
This
This
was
understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a rabbit hole. I mean, I think,
Right.
I've been a board member, I'm an independent school product. My kids all went to independent schools. And so, you start to go to some of these conferences, you start to see the programming, and you start to see some themes. And then as things, evolve, you see more of the same theme and more of the same thing. And you just start to think, well, all these schools are spending tons of money sending their teachers to professional development. And over the past, however many, 3 to 5 years, it has been so focused on literally DEI, the equity of feelings, grading for equity, things that as a parent of an independent school child, you're thinking, well, where's the STEM information? Like, what's the best math program, or how to make sure every kid is reading fluently by, grade, whatever. And so the other real moment, I think, where a lot of parents really sort of stood up and took notice is that I would say September of 2020, right after the summer that we had where everybody got turned upside down, a lot of the schools invited Ibram X. Kendi to come speak.
Yeah.
He was the poster child for ASNE for a lot of the independent schools and NAIS, and they spent a ton of money. And this was the programming that they trotted out to all the parents, all the board members, and everybody was just supposed to accept this worldview. And we started asking questions and said, wow, that's interesting that you've hired this man who has become the spokesperson for a movement. Where's the counter programming? Do you have someone to come and talk to him? Where's Glenn Lowry or Thomas Sowell or John McWhorter? Name one. We'd love to see some balance.
Right. And you're talking about Glenn Lowry, right?
Yes.
Right. And these other leaders in challenging the ideas of this ideology called critical race theory and anti-racism, that is another buzzword, as you said, that sounds really great, but in fact is promoting some of its own divisiveness and indoctrination, as well as concepts like racial segregation in some of these schools with phenomena like affinity circles, right? These are the kind of dynamics that you started seeing emerge in the fall of 2020 and later.
Well, no, I mean, ironically, this has been going on in private schools for
Yeah.
years, maybe decades, right? I think actually private schools started a lot of this because when you trace a lot of it back, private schools were the original schools. And I should probably narrow down my focus. We're talking sort of more of the independent. I'm not talking about the religious schools or some of the parochial schools, but let's just say the independent schools that are non-religious based. Most of them for the past, 10 years have had DEI officers. They've had departments. They've been very proud of this work. And in fact, if you go to their websites, you can see it very clearly what they're doing and why they're doing it. But again, it depends on your frame of reference. And as a parent, it depends on if you actually take the time to read the website or to understand where that is prioritized within the school day. So it became a thing where it was maybe part of the school day. It would be a diversity day. You'd spend one day on it a year. But then over time, I think what the inflection point was is that it became a sense of urgency around this whole conversation. So the work accelerated, the amount of time accelerated. And I think these schools then felt pressure to create these DEI plans, which all seemed to spring up after that summer. They heard from alums. There was a Black at Instagram account that, would be a great investigative journalism report for somebody to find out the origin of that. There's been talk that it was a well-coordinated attempt by BLM to mobilize alums and students at a lot of these schools. But in effect, what it did was create polarization among alums who demanded certain things from their schools. The schools all, didn't know what to do, overcorrected potentially, came out with these plans, hired a bunch of consultants, stoked an industry, and it just kept rolling. And here we are.
Yeah. And if our viewers are wondering, this is the same pattern that happened in public schools. In an earlier episode, we talked about the results of a report that we completed last year on the diversity industry, and we called it the woke industrial complex. And in that, we showed the pattern of woke grooming of school districts. And actually, just like you're talking about, the same pattern that you're documenting is what the private school industry went through. And a lot of it was prompted by efforts after the tragedy of George Floyd's killing to virtue signal and to bring forward, their agendas on the term of social justice, which conceptually could be positive, but just like you're describing, it ended up becoming its own multi-million-dollar industry inside of the private school world, supported by this organization, then the NAIS, as you call it. What is it that you're finding parents are able to do, and how effective are they when they raise questions like you did?
Well, it's very school dependent, Asra, and I think that's the challenge. I think it's really arming parents with questions that they should ask and not feel scared asking. Because again, parents are terrified in private schools to speak up. There's threat of retaliation against their student. They're worried they're going to get kicked out if they violate a clause in their enrollment contract. Everyone's terrified their child's not going to get into college, you name it. And so this self-censoring that's been going on at these schools has been going on for a very long time. I would say even prior to the 2016 election. But the tools that we're able to give parents are just simple questions you can ask, right? Because if you're assuming that a lot of this work is taking place during the school day and you're spending a lot of money to send your child to a private school, you would expect that this subject, whatever you want to call it, is presented with the same rigor, scholarship, evidence, however you want to group it, as every other class, right? So for example, what is the evidence that this approach works? Right. How are you going to measure success? What goals are you even setting for this work? And I'd like to see the curriculum and the syllabus for the work, because you're going to give me that for math and you're going to give me that for science at back to school night. So if you're saying this isn't an academic subject and worthy of spending however many hours a week in my school, let's see it. And if you can't give us those, data points, then you have to question the validity and the relevance. And so then you say, well, then it's a colossal waste of time. So why are you dedicating time to this when you could be dedicating time to STEM or whatever, extracurricular is probably more beneficial to more children? I think the other piece is the division that it causes. It causes people to really start to think about things maybe differently. Affinity groups have always been a thing at schools, and I'm not sure parents ever realized that they were segregation. So when you mention that to them, they start to think, oh, interesting, okay. So that's another question we ask them to raise. And then the biggest question, I think, for private schools is just the model of governance. The trustees are supposed to be running the school. The problem is NAIS has defined best practices for trustee governance. And so they have 3 jobs: uphold the mission of the school, fiduciary, and overseeing the head of school. The thing is, NAIS gives every new trustee the book that says how to be a great trustee, which is basically you support your head of school unequivocally, you keep your hands out of the curriculum, which is true, and you're basically told to just sort of shut up, write checks, and approve the budget and do whatever the head says. And so most of these trustees are parents, so they do that. Now, what they don't realize is they should be asking questions around process, because process matters. They should be really thoughtful about how they're evaluating their head of school, how the head of school is then evaluating the teachers. Is there a way to evaluate your head of school to ensure that, ideology and divisiveness is not part of the curriculum? Is there a way to evaluate whether or not the head is spending too much of his or her time prioritizing a social agenda? These are ways trustees really can move the needle at their schools. They haven't really known to do this. They haven't known that they needed to, and they're scared. And in cases where you can help them understand what's really going on and give them the tools and the questions they can ask, we can make headway. And we've seen that happen.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because, governance is not restricted to the federal, state, local government, but in fact, governance is often talked about in terms of corporate governance. And so it's really about just having folks widen their lens, right, on what it is that good leadership looks like. And every example that you're citing, I think, is an example that you have seen in the trenches, isn't it?
It is. Again, every school is different. Their issues are different, but the common themes are the governance model at these schools. And I think that that's really the opportunity, because you talked earlier about how bad PR is also very dangerous for schools. And it is, but it comes and it goes, and they seem to muddle through. The other pain point, I think, for schools, and something that nobody really talks about, is the financial model. These schools, the big schools have massive endowments. They will be fine. But a lot of the schools that are not the big schools with the massive endowments, they're sort of hanging on by a thread. Their budgets are very, very tight. One wrong economic downturn can cause major turmoil. They're heavily reliant on tuition. That's how they make their money. Their expenses are based on paying great teachers, healthcare, things go up, buildings, grounds. So again, there are pain points that these schools have that would make a parent pause when they think, they're going to kick me out so easily. The schools don't want to kick out parents. They really don't, especially if it's a non-entry year. Because again, schools have different entry years. It's not like there's a waiting list for every single grade. There are certain grades that are easier to fill than others. And so again, if a group of parents were to come together and have a legitimate conversation, know what outcome they're trying to achieve with people at their school, these schools used to value partnership with parents. And again, it's easier to keep the parents you have than it is to refill seats constantly if people are churning through the system.
Well, amazing. I mean, thank you so much for this phenomenal work that you're doing, because I know that just like we face with public school parents, the private school parents are even struggling even more to try to figure out how to express themselves and empower themselves. So thank you so much, Ashley, because you're just doing such important work for parents out there that should be valued and have their voices heard. So really appreciate it. And so now let's talk to Scott Johnston. Scott, Ashley laid out really well the challenges. You brought it to life through this phenomenal blog that you've got that I recommend that everybody follow, called the Naked Dollar blog. First, you have to explain to folks how it got that name and how you got blogging. And then please take us into the trenches of what you have seen and what you have witnessed and what you've documented.
Sure. My origin story in this is probably a bit different than almost everybody else on this call, who I would assume are parents who are horrified by what they've discovered going on in their kids' schools. Mine was a bit different. It goes back. I started a blog called The Naked Dollar, which originally, this is 15 or 20 years ago, was kind of a snarky financial blog. Which I had great fun writing, but occasionally I would write about my own alma mater's descent into ideological madness, and sort of poke that bear. And then fast forward to I was at a conference on the future of free speech. That's literally what it was called, at Yale. And mind you, it wasn't sponsored by Yale. Yale isn't big on things like free speech these days, nor are any of the Ivies. But it was physically held on their campus. 200 students showed up to try and shut the conference down, physically shut it down. I have it on good authority. They skipped irony class that morning, using their free speech rights to shut down a free speech conference. But that was insane. I remember walking out of the conference thinking, why hasn't anybody used all this craziness to write a good satiric novel? Because humor is a great weapon. Humor is perhaps a better weapon and more instructive and more effective than 1,000 letters to editors. But I'd never written fiction before. It didn't occur to me that I should do something like this. But then fast forward to my college reunion, where late one evening I was holding a door open for an undergraduate, and she stopped dead in her tracks, and she would not walk through the door and accused me of patriarchy for holding the door open. And I think it was at that precise moment I said, I'm going to figure out how to write a damn novel. And so I did, and then probably it got it published. It's called Campusland. And then further, and probably it went to number 15 on Amazon, and it's going to be a TV series, a streaming TV series.
Amazing, amazing. I mean, you took that irony lesson that those kids missed, and allowed parents also and regular folks in the world to just laugh about what this identity politics and gender politics and that end up making a man such as yourself a symbol of the patriarchy, right? Just for holding a door open. So then you ended up, and that was in the higher ed world, right? But you hadn't touched K through 12 at that point. So how did that end up on your radar? Correct.
So in the late fall of 2020, following what I call the Summer of George, I was contacted by someone on the inside at the Dalton School in New York. And if you're not familiar with the Dalton School, I'm sure most people are, but if you're not, it's one of a small handful of Manhattan private schools that are among the schools you want to go to if you have a lot of money. So it has a great and storied reputation. It's always been on the more progressive side of things, for sure. But this person contacts me and says, "You're not going to believe what's going on here. There's this list of demands that the teachers have made, 8 pages long, and it's insane. And the board's in turmoil. And this person wanted to get the story out there.
Yeah.
And I had my little blog, and they thought, well, maybe you can write about it. And they sent me the list of demands, which I put in their entirety on the blog. It ended up being a series of pieces, and further ended up being a Wall Street Journal op-ed a year ago, like 13 months ago.
Yeah.
And the demands, I'll just give you a couple of examples. Black teachers should be paid more than white teachers. Half the money that people donate to the school, private donations, should be rerouted to the New York City public school system. And the one that really set off the progressive moms and dads was this was a bridge too far for them. Most of the other stuff wasn't. Was the fact that they wanted to get rid of AP classes within 2 years if the Black students were not qualifying for them in the same numbers as white students. Which absolutely would have gotten rid of AP classes, and can't have that because got to get into Yale and Harvard.
Yeah, and just for everybody, just to connect the dots, Aimee gave us the lay of the land. The Dalton School was part of this emergence, right, in the United States of an independent school. Ashley gave us an introduction to the dynamic of these schools going woke. And right there then in November 2020, as these schools were making that transition, you got your inside scoop about what was going on at the Dalton School. And one of the points you just raised about, the dynamic of the going woke is exactly what was happening in the public schools, as parents know very much. And so, the dynamic that you're taking us into is exactly what schools across the country have been facing.
But worse in many respects. What a lot of people don't appreciate is, and by the way, it's worth mentioning, the naked dollar completely blew up when I started reporting on this stuff. And then I subsequently reported on some other schools because I kept doing the information.
Yeah, all of a sudden you got this new readership, right?
Well, I got 1 million hits in 4 weeks, which is ridiculous for my little blog.
And I think I just want to make this one small point also, because you didn't say, but are you, before you wrote your novel and started your blog, like, was this your field? Were you a writer and a journalist?
No. I was for a while. I was a Wall Street guy, and then I co-founded 2 different technology companies, which we subsequently sold. And I've done a bunch of different stuff.
Yeah, so this is just an illustration that, nowadays we have so many platforms. There's Medium, there's Substack, there's Patch.com. We mentioned a lot of these resources on our website, defendinged.org. And so, Scott, you took this new opportunity, right, of the new media that is allowed on the internet. And parents can do that, and as you did, you reported out the facts, right? You just laid it out. You literally put down what the demands were. And that's sometimes so important in basically sharing and educating other parents, sharing the information and educating other parents about what's going on in the trenches.
Agreed. Because there was a phenomenon I noticed as soon as I would write about a particular school, and I subsequently wrote about schools like Brearley and Spence, the piece would go viral because it would start by getting passed around to all the parents at that school. And it was kind of a holy crap moment for many of them. Like, is this really happening? Because a lot of people have their heads in the sand because it's more comfortable, right? To ask these questions is very difficult if your kid's in the school and, are you violating your contract? And it's people don't like that kind of tension. It really was remarkable to watch. And just to follow up on a previous point, about the private schools perhaps being worse, there are fewer impediments for the private schools changing how they operate. If you're a public school, you have state laws and regulations, you have school boards and open school board meetings, and it's a more difficult process. In a private school, you can do whatever you want and as quickly as you want. And that summer of George, they all went and quickly rewrote everything. And some parents started noticing, because everyone was on Zoom that fall, and they'd walk by their kids' lesson and go, "Oh my God, what did I just hear?"
Yeah. And of course, you're referring to the summer of 2020 after the killing of George Floyd, in which there were so many protests. And as Ashley pointed out, one of the mechanisms for shaming private schools became this black at or racism at, and then fill in the blank for the name of the private school. And that was happening in the public school world too, as part of the cycle of the schools and school districts going woke, where you'd have some big aha moment that the school boards or the trustees would seize upon then to bring in the equity audit or the new diversity officer and the new initiatives that you ended up hearing about in the fall of 2020. So
I like calling out the boards. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the boards, because I wrote a piece. This one went viral also, called All the Lovely People, which is about the board members of these private schools. They tend to be very successful, otherwise they wouldn't be on the boards. They tend to be, center or center left politically, but they're successful, so they've navigated a career of being careful politically. They do not tend to be rabid leftists or progressives, but they are literally overseeing the overthrow of Western culture and civilization, because that's what's going on here. This is a culture war, and the aim of it from the other side is to overthrow all the tenets of the Enlightenment and Western culture as we understand it. So, for instance, I want to read one brief thing that came out of one of the NAIS training sessions about what whiteness is. So this is a brief paragraph. Here's some things that are whiteness: perfectionism, punctuality, urgency, niceness, worship of the written word, progress, objectivity, rigor, individualism, capitalism, and liberalism are some of the characteristics of white supremacy culture in need of elimination. That's the goal here. That's what's going on. Make no mistake about it. We are in a war.
Yeah. And, I know that that chart very well. I used to teach cross-cultural communications and would teach to the military folks going to Afghanistan, and would teach them that there was a way of looking at culture in terms of low context and high context. And low context culture were people who wanted to show up on time, had to have an agenda for meetings. And I was training them that, in Afghanistan, a lot of people are high context. Then, they got to chit chat and find out the relationships between folks. And it was the Marines that I would be training from the South in Georgia, who were high context Marines, many of them white, some of them not. But what the diversity consultants have done is basically stolen that concept and assigned race to it, just like they have with so many other their bad ideas. And I completely agree with you that this is what it is that they are using to create a race war. And just like you said, associate the West with whiteness and then seek to dismantle these kind of attributes that are actually ones that are usually positive, right? Showing up on time and having goals in life. But just like you said about the academic advanced placement classes and the war on that as a phenomena, that's the war on merit and an accomplishment. And so I think that's what you're talking about, right? When you say that there's an actual war on the West and a lot of the values in our society.
So I call it ethno-Marxism.
Mhm.
because it really is. And I wrote a piece on this in the Naked Dollar if you want to see the historical background of like sort of where this came from. But it's nothing in the old Marxism. It was all about class, and the proletariat were meant to rise up against those who own the means of production, and there'd be a class war. The Marxists were a little disappointed that never really happened. They didn't rise up anywhere. In fact, where Marxism succeeded, it was usually by a coup. So they retooled it and basically swapped race for class, and now the oppressed are categorized by race, not class, and they're the ones who are supposed to rise up. Extremely clever. They're nothing if not clever, but
Yeah.
make no mistake, that's what's going on here.
Yeah, and the dynamic is very relevant in this conversation because what you have are folks who are then shamed as parents also, and that's not a healthy and good dynamic in society. And by default, the children are shamed, right? And that is also very unhealthy for any child to have to endure. And so this is just one more of the failures of this approach. And I really applaud all of the work that you've done to expose this and make it come to life. So I'd love to bring everybody back together and ask you, what is your advice for private school parents? You know, folks have a different landscape, as you pointed out so well, Aimee. What's your advice first?
Well, I would say, Asra, that there are many advantages that a private school can offer at any stage of a child's development. And parents could have any number of reasons for deciding to enroll their child in a private school. And as I mentioned earlier, parents are the best advocates for their children. They know their children best. And so the circumstances that could lead them to private school can happen at any stage in their child's education. But I would encourage them to consider kind of that stage that they're in when evaluating or deciding when would be the right time to do that, to make a switch, to enroll, or to transition from one type of school to another. Of course, are they in their early years, their middle school years, or their high school years? Those are certainly things that we want to consider. But I would also say, after narrowing your school search to schools that you think align well with your priorities as a parent and the development of your child, talk to the school administrators to determine if the school is a good fit for your child. It's a good idea to enroll to speak to students who are already enrolled and to perhaps to some of their parents. And taking that extra step will give you a peek into that school community. And just like in public school, be educated about what's going on. Read all the paperwork. Be familiar with the syllabus. Meet with the teacher. Talk to the heads of school, and just make sure that you're as present as you can possibly be engaged, and of course, you're your child's best advocate. And so I encourage them to be that advocate and to make sure that they hold their schools accountable.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, this applies to every parent out there. So that is very great universal advice.
Can I add to that, Azra?
Yes, please, please.
So that applies to what Aimee said apply to when you're looking for a school. So the further question is, what do you do if you're already in a school and you're very upset about how it's being run? Mm-hmm. There are no easy options in this scenario. And you are bound by that contract, which lets them throw you out for just about any reason or throw your kids out. If you want to fight, team up, find other people who think like you and form a group. They're not going to throw out 30 of you at once. So that's option one. Option two, bad press. While they do sometimes shake it off, it can have an effect. After the Naked Dollar broke the Dalton story, the headmaster was fired, and he was awful. He should have been fired. But mind you, he wasn't fired because they disagreed inside with all the woke stuff they were doing. He was fired because of the publicity. You don't let these things, these inside things get out of house. And if none of this works, then you have to look at leaving. What's more important than your kids' education? If they're being told as little white kids that there are oppressors, and if you're a BIPOC kid, you're permanently oppressed. You shouldn't stay. So your options are maybe parochial schools. They're somewhat better. Some states, I know people moved to Florida where the private and public schools are quite a bit better on all this stuff. You can form homeschooling pods. Again, these are all things that require a great deal of sacrifice and commitment, but these are your kids we're talking about.
That's fantastic. And I know that groups have emerged like Undercover Moms with social media presence and blogs to basically educate other parents. And, it's worth remembering that Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King said that education was the first step in any nonviolent movement. And, it can be considered a part of letting people know exactly what's happening. What's your advice, Ashley?
I think these are all great. I think finding your people is super important. That's been really hard over the past 2 years because what's worked really well for these schools is the fact that nobody's met in person. Boards haven't met in person. So there's no side conversations happening. There's no parent potluck. So parents aren't able to gather. So we have to, first of all, address the COVID situation. These schools have been so focused on that they've sort of delegated all this stuff to other people, and parents haven't sort of been able to get together to form their groups. So I think that's the first step. I agree. I think philosophically, parents have to really decide, are they interested in education or credentials, right? Because at the end of the day, a lot of the really elite schools, they're getting credentials, not so much education. So knowing that no school's perfect, as a parent, you've got to figure out what your priorities are and where you're going to supplement. You may have to get more involved in your kids' education than you ever thought. I think a lot of parents have blindly trusted these schools. They figure, we're forking over $60,000 a year to send our kids to these fancy schools. We can just detach and let the school take care of it. But I think what you're seeing is that you can't trust these schools anymore, and you'd like to, but for now you can't. So I think it's being able to have conversations with your children. Tell me what you're learning in school. How did your day go? You've got to re-engage in their lives and be active participants in what they're doing. And then you may need to have to do some counter programming at home and ask interesting questions. And, how do you feel about this? And, I understand you're spending a day talking about this. And, what are your thoughts? And did they provide any other perspectives? Because again, I think what we would like to see is children feeling empowered to start to speak up in class, right? Because the parents are the ones fighting this battle right now. But at the end of the day, the kids have to start to fight. And I worry that COVID has created an entire generation. You saw the Wall Street Journal op-ed recently, the Harvard student wrote about these excellent sheep. Never can I remember a time in history where people have been so complicit and so submissive, and everybody says, do this, do that, and we just take it. And it seems like this is just yet another example of that. Wear your mask, sit over here, don't talk to anybody, take this, as this one worldview as the only truth, don't question. That is terrifying. So I see this as a symptom of a bigger issue. And I think as parents, we really need to encourage our children to start to toughen up a little bit and ask difficult questions. And you know what, if my kid were to get kicked out of school because he asked an important question in a conversation, I would deal with that. But I would rather have that scenario than my kid who, becomes a kid who's anxious and is afraid to speak up in class because he or she might say the wrong thing, or the mask drips down low and they get a detention. I mean, at some point we have to sort of move forward collectively as a society and say, this is not boding well for our future.
Oh my gosh, that was so well put, because really what we are always have to keep an eye on is, what future generation are we basically educating today, right? And that's such a great reminder that you've given us. Well, I want to thank you all so much. We have some great questions from our members and parents who watch us. Let me ask you this one first, Ashley. Of the schools and the parents that you talk to, are the private schools only in ultra liberal cities like Boston and New York going on this trajectory of going, quote, woke and becoming, problematic?
No, that's what's terrifying. I'm literally getting calls from people in Florida, in Texas, if you can believe, Atlanta. It's spread throughout the country, Colorado. I mean, you name it. I don't think any school is immune. And I think the common thread is they're all members of NAIS. And that is the big behemoth that, needs to be addressed. And I think schools either need to defect or demand balance be brought into the conversation. Because again, as parents unite, we're not trying to silence conversations. We're not trying to ban books. We're just trying to put things in their appropriate place and get kids the ability to speak up and question, because kids need to know a lot of different things, but they also need to be able to learn to critically think so they can disprove stupid theories, which a lot of this is. So I think that when you have NAIS dictating all of the programming and all of the professional development and all of the best practices, there needs to be alternatives. And that's partly what we're trying to do too, is to introduce a lot of the thought leaders in this space right now to the independent school world so that they know that there are books you can read that are not written by certain people. There are other people doing great work.
Yeah, that there's alternatives to your earlier point, that there's point of view diversity on many of these issues, all of these issues really. So tell me, the call. Aimee, you had raised this point earlier, but would you reflect especially on your views on school choice? This is one of the questions here, as it relates to folks that are in public school thinking about private school.
Sure. Obviously, if parents are the people who know their children best, they should be able to make the choice that works best for their child. And not everyone has the opportunity to be able to support out-of-pocket tuition. And so, as I mentioned, there is at least one form of private school choice in 32 states right now, District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. And what we have seen, Asra, this past year specifically, is that so many states have begun to introduce school choice legislation where there may not have been options before, because of course parents are looking for smaller class sizes, better parental involvement, more rigorous academic programs, specialized attention for their students, and they're trying to make sure that they can find the best fit for their family and for their child. And so I think we're going to see a lot more in this particular space in the coming months and into the next couple of years.
All right, great. And we have a question here on how parents can find out about the diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants at their private school. And definitely want to recommend that you guys go to something that we published last year at Parents Defending Education called the Consultant Report Card. And we have profiles of many consultants out there in this multi-million-dollar industry. You can see if we have a profile on the consultant that might be at your school. Ask your school administration who they are hiring. And if you cannot find out more information, please send us a tip at defendinged.org, and we will do our own investigating. So here's a question for you, Scott. How do I find out if a private school is quote unquote woke before enrolling my child? So what is your checklist?
Well, you on their website, they don't hide this stuff, really. They don't hide who their diversity consultants are and what their priorities are. A lot of their mission statements have been rewritten to emphasize social justice over learning. If anyone's interested, by the way, I wrote an expose of one of these ODS DEI consultants called Pollyanna, and they're one of the bigger ones. And they were basically spawned by the Dalton School a few years back. And none of these people really have any credentials to speak of. I actually put their bios in the piece. They're grifters, honestly. But they've created. I guess you could give them credit for being very entrepreneurial. They've created a very large industry. But anyway, the answer to your question is start with the website. Of course, ask parents. This information is not hidden at all.
Yeah, I mean, all you have to do is look up the school name and the word equity, diversity, inclusion, affinity groups. And just like you said, part of the agenda is virtue signaling. So in order to be virtue signaling, you have to be performative and you have to brag about it. And so oftentimes it's right out there. And another tip that we got in doing our own investigating is you may hear about the consultant at your private school and not be able to get the contract, but then look at that consultant's client list and see if they have public school public school clients, and you can then file a Freedom of Information Act request at the public school district in order to see how much money they normally get paid, what kind of services they provide. You're going to see an amazing case study that we've put up now on Parents Defending Education's website in our new private school report on a consultant just like that. So let's see. The last question is, Ashley, I'll send this to you, is if my school is a member of the National Association of Independent Schools, how do I convince them, and should they convince them, to join another association?
There's really no other association. That's the problem. NAIS is really the only player in town. So I guess you would have to ask your school what benefits they derive for being a member of NAIS. And it's not even that it matters that they're members, it's just what sort of resources are they taking from NAIS and where's the balance. So if they're doing all the professional development, all of the training, all of the speakers, whatever it is through NAIS, they're using it a lot. Not all schools do. And so again, it's a little bit deceitful to say that that's going to solve all the problems, because a lot of these schools just do what every other school does. They're supposed to be independent schools, but they're actually completely dependent. And the heads of school, I think, use NAIS for cover for decisions they don't want to make. And that was very clear during COVID, and also for all the DEI stuff. If head of school has a bunch of angry teachers, which is usually where this starts, demanding that they do certain things, it's a lot easier for the head to go to NAIS and look at all the best practices and take the menu and incorporate it at their school than it is to stand up to their teachers and say, you know what, this is not who we are as a school, and we're going to take a different direction. They just don't have the time to do it. They're overworked. COVID, like I said, has thrown a huge curveball to all these schools just trying to stay open. And so I think that they've maybe delegated a lot of this programming to their underlings, who really seized the opportunity to make it their signature piece.
Excellent. Well, I want to just thank you all so much, because while you speak with such clarity and courage, I know that it takes a lot of reflection and meditation to get to the point for anyone to speak publicly about these issues, no matter how strong you feel and how convinced you are that you are on the correct path. So each one of you, I know, has, lost friends perhaps, but won the larger battle that Scott put so well for important values in our society. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done and just being an inspiration to parents everywhere. Can you tell us, Ashley, how folks can find Parents Unite, and whether they can follow you on social media, or where they can join your efforts?
Yes, so parentsunite.org. And also we are hosting our second annual conference. We hosted a Diversity of Thought K-12 education conference in Boston, and we're going to do it again this year, October 14th through 16th. We'll be posting stuff on our website soon. We're still in the early stages, but it was a great success. We introduced a ton of great thought leaders to the independent school world. Charles Love has agreed to come back as an MC. Ian Rose already signed up. We've got some fire people, PDE people, and then we'll have a bunch of other thought leaders around the country who are doing incredible work. So keep an eye out for that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Scott, where can folks follow your blog and your great writing?
So learning about a lot of this stuff is relentlessly depressing. So if you want to learn and laugh at the same time, this is a naked plug. You can read my book, Campusland. I write at the.
Everybody needs humor to lift their spirits.
It will make you laugh, but I also write at the Naked Dollar, where when I do this reporting on stuff, I also try to make it humorous at the same time.
Yeah.
And on Twitter, I'm at sjohnston60.
Great. And then Aimee, your great work folks can find at defendinged.org. And really, again, appreciate every bit of advice and guidance and insight you all have provided. I've learned a lot, and I, started this conversation talking about my mom, who raised me, to be able to be the kind of critical thinker that you're talked about, Ashley, and that we all wish, in society. So what I want to invite all our parents and all our viewers to do is educate yourself, so that we can help to raise this very enlightened and educated generation. Please ask the questions that Ashley, Amy, and Scott have talked to us about. Please go to defendinged.org and read the incredible work that our staff has provided to you about private schools. And then finally, please, at defendinged.org, send us your tips. We will investigate. We want to share with folks, your stories from the trenches, hold folks accountable, and educate, our community so that we can help to raise this beautiful, great generation of kids that are in our schools today. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Stay in touch, join our newsletter, follow us at Defending Ed, and just stay strong, everyone. Thank you again, Amy, Scott, and Ash.
Thanks, Asra.
Thanks, Asra, Amy, and Scott.